Hey, this is Dr. Jackson, and today we're going to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft. And you're going to have a lecture with me today because, frankly, I couldn't find any films that I thought were really appropriate for this particular lecture. So it's going to be a lot easier for you to follow along with me if you have a copy of the Vindication on the Rights of Woman open. So you can do a split screen, you can print it out, whatever it is that you want to do, but it will make it a lot easier for you to follow along with the lecture if you have that in front of you, because we'll kind of go through it piece by piece. But I want to start by giving you a little background information about Mary Wollstonecraft. She's a really interesting person. She did not have a happy home life at all. Her father inherited a lot of money and he tried to become a farmer, but he was an alcoholic. So, he couldn't be successful because he had that problem. And her home life was chaotic, as you can imagine if you know anything about having a parent who's addicted or any type of addiction in your family. But she had to kind of serve almost as a parent to the rest of her family. When her mother died, she had to nurse her through her illness. Um, she had a sister who had what they would have called at the time a nervous breakdown. We might now say it was some type of emotional breakdown, but she had to take care of her. Um, she had the same sister had a husband who was really abusive to her, and Mary Wollstonecraft had to kind of talk her sister into leaving her husband. Well, that sounds like a sensible response to us sitting here in the 21st century. But during the time that Mary Wollstonecraft lived, a married woman really didn't have very many rights. She didn't have rights to her children. Any property she might have brought to the marriage actually became her husband's property at the time that they got married. So it was really a precarious and almost dangerous thing for her to suggest that her sister leave that abusive husband, but they did it and they were successful at doing that. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft also had a best friend. Her friend's name was Frances Blood, but they called her by the nickname Fanny. And they were best friends, just the same way that you would have a best friend. And Fanny got sick. She had tuberculosis, which was one of the leading diseases of the day. They didn't know a lot about how you got it. It's actually a viral infection, and now you can take antibiotics, or probably you had some type of booster shot when you were a child to prevent you from getting tuberculosis. But during the time that Mary Wollstonecraft lived, people died from tuberculosis all the time. You might hear it called TB for tuberculosis. You might hear it called consumption. It's called consumption because it would literally consume your health and kind of eat you alive. And when somebody gets really sick with TB, one of the last things they do is to start coughing up blood. And once that happens, the person's not going to make it. So, because it's viral, it would spread in families, and you'd have family members afflicted with it. But she nursed her friend Fanny through TB, and by the time Fanny got sick, she had a daughter um, that Mary Wollstonecraft had to kind of become a pseudo parent for. Um, so she had all these responsibilities to her sister, to her friend, to her family. And because she was from the middle class, one of the only jobs that was available to her was to become a governess. Now, a governess is a teacher, and you might think, wow, that's not that bad a job. Certainly, it's what I do, it's what I'm doing right now. But a governess is different than a classroom teacher, because a governess would go and live with a family, and she would be responsible for the education of the children. She wasn't really a servant, so she wasn't part of that group of people, and she wasn't part of the family. Her salary would be incredibly low. She might make about $25 a year, which would 25 pounds a year, excuse me, which would be the equivalent of, less than about $100 a year. Now, certainly she got room and board. She had a place to sleep and food to eat, living with that family. But less than $100 to do everything that you need to do to buy your clothing, send any money home, take care of any medical expenses. It's not a lucrative job, and it could be very isolating because you weren't a member of the family and you weren't a member of the servant class. So it was hard work. She did not particularly enjoy it. She did not stay in that work for very long. She moved to London, and she made friends with this man, Joseph Johnson. And because she kind of had some aspirations to write, she talked to him about a piece that she had written called Mary, a Fiction, and he published that for her. And it was moderately successful. You can still read it. I've read it. It's fairly interesting, fairly easy to read. She was an incredibly intelligent person and an incredibly curious person, and we might refer to her as an autodidact. And that word means that she's self taught. She did not really have a formal education the way that you're getting a formal education. She just was curious. And so she made sure that she taught herself, or that she found out things and learned. And she was very well informed, very intelligent, very lively person. Now, around the time that all these things are going on, the French Revolution is going on, and she decided, as many people did, to go to Paris to observe the French Revolution. Now, that may sound just completely crazy to us until you start to realize how many people actually did that. William Wordsworth did it. Um, lots of famous people did it, but at any rate, she went there. She observed, um, and she wrote some papers about her reactions to the French Revolution, and those are things that you can still read if you choose to do that. She also met this man, Gilbert Emily. Gilbert Emily was an American. Um, he was, I think you guys would probably call him a player. He got around. He had lots of girlfriends, and they started a romance, and it was not happy. And she got pregnant and decided that her only choice, her only option was to try to drown herself. And she was not successful, thankfully. And that's suicide's not a good option. If that's something that you're thinking about, talk to somebody about it. Call the suicide prevention line. I think they've just changed their phone number to 988. That's all you have to dial, and there's somebody there to talk to you about that. But nonetheless, she did try to do that. She was unsuccessful. Um, Tried to get back together with Gilbert Emily, and he just wasn't interested. He was kind of, I'm done with you. I don't want to raise a child with you. I'm interested in making a baby. I'm just not interested in having a baby. So they broke up. She named that child Fanny after her friend Fanny Blood, who had died. And she had to kind of, find a way to take care of her daughter. During this time, it was incredibly expensive to travel. So, travel narratives were really popular. People would buy books about going traveling. So, Mary Wollstonecraft decided to take a trip to Scandinavia, and she went to Sweden and Norway and Denmark and published her kind of letters that she wrote about her experiences in traveling those places. And it sold pretty well. She described going to Copenhagen and Oslo and Stockholm. And if you couldn't afford to travel, it was fun to go ahead and just read about it and try to imagine it. They didn't have Instagram or TikTok or any of the things that we have to share those experiences. And so she wrote about it and sold it. And good for her, was able to make some money to try to support her daughter and herself. She did move to London, and she tried to commit suicide again. This time she jumped off one of the many bridges in London into the Thames. The Thames is this long, snaky river that you see. It floats all the way through London. Again, she was unsuccessful, which is good. Gilbert Emily went back to Paris. She decided to go ahead and try to make it on her own. And she renewed a friendship that she had with this man, William Godwin. William Godwin at the time was really famous. He was a thinker. And you think, how could you be famous as a thinker? But, think about it this way: Steve Jobs was a thinker, Stephen Hawking was a thinker, Bill Gates is a thinker. So it does happen that people who execute, important things also did that because they're good at thinking things through. But William Godwin was really, he was popular. He had written some books and he was just famous as a thinker. So people like William Wordsworth and Lord Byron and Mary Wollstonecraft would seek him out to talk to him about politics and philosophy. And the first time Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin met, they really did not like each other. He thought she was just kind of a babbling woman, kind of like, shut up, woman. Do you ever stop talking? And she thought he was a snob, but on their second go around, they became very attracted to one another. And before you know it, a romance started. And before you know it, she's pregnant. And this couple, both of them had been very outspoken against marriage. Marriage is just legalized prostitution. It makes the woman a piece of property. And they did the conventional thing. They got married because she was pregnant. And of course, people made fun of them and criticized them because they got married, but they were in love. Now, they did agree that they would live in separate homes and that they would have kind of separate lives and spend time together when they wanted to. So, their idea of marriage would have been considered very controversial and very modern at the time. But nonetheless, she's pregnant, they're happy, and she gives birth to a daughter who becomes Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. You may have heard of her. She wrote a little book called Frankenstein. Now, not too long, less than a week after Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to her daughter, Mary, she died. She died of what's called childbed fever. Mary Shelley went on to marry Percy Bysshe Shelley, the poet. But Mary Wollstonecraft died of a disease called puerperal fever. It was really common at the time. Sometimes it's called childbed fever. And what happens, it may sound gross to you. It is kind of gross. I'm pretty squeamish. The placenta doesn't separate from the uterine wall, and it causes an infection. And it would be a very painful death. And all sorts of women died from this disease. Some of Henry VIII, the king with the six wives, one of his wives, his favorite wife, died of puerperal fever. It was incredibly common. They just didn't know what we know about childbirth. And so it happened all the time. But she died within days of her daughter being born. And if you read Frankenstein, one of the ongoing themes in that novel is the fear of birth. What happens if I give birth to something? What happens if it's hideous? What happens if I can't love it? What happens if I abandon it? So it's a huge, huge theme in that book. And if you know that, it can really inform your reading and make that novel, which is incredible, much deeper for you. So I wanted to read you this quote because it is a legal quote from the time when Mary Wollstonecraft was alive. And it is that when a husband and wife exchanged vows, they became one person. And in the words of the jurist William Blackstone, who was very famous, powerful, the husband is that person. Now, that's what I said to you just a few minutes ago, that when a husband and wife married, that the wife really did not have very many legal rights. It was incredibly difficult to divorce. Um, if a woman left her husband, she couldn't take the children because they belonged to the husband. Um, he could force her to come back. So it was just, she just didn't have very many rights. And it's not that men are bad and women are good, it's just that was a legal fact. Women did not have many rights to their own person. And this is part of what Mary Wollstonecraft is writing about in A Vindication on the Rights of Woman. She's trying to figure that out and hash that out. Why has that happened? And what can we do about it? One of the other things that happened as a result of Mary Wollstonecraft saying that she wanted women to have rights is more and more jobs opened up to women. For instance, Florence Nightingale opened up the profession of nursing. And up until the time that Florence Nightingale became a famous nurse, nursing was something that was relegated to very lower class women with no training. Often nurses were drunks, they were prostitutes, or both. And Nightingale made it a noble profession, something that people could be proud of, and that a woman who was from a good family and a good background could undertake as a noble profession and an option that she could have in addition to being a governess. So, middle class women, women in the same class that Mary Wollstonecraft was from, really didn't have a lot of vocational work kind of related training. They would have learned how to read and write, certainly. They would have learned how to cipher, which is what they call do math, but they wouldn't have done any advanced math. It would have been addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. There would not have been any geometry or algebra or calculus. That would have been very unusual. Some women did learn that, of course, but it would have been a pretty unusual thing because why would she need it? She's not going to be doing that type of thing. She doesn't need to worry about that. She would have learned how to do needlework so that she could do repair to garments, but more important, that she could do fancy embroidery and make things pretty and decorate things. So it was not so much the utility of sewing as the decoration, because she was a decoration for the house. She might have learned how to play an instrument or how to sing a little bit. Certainly, she would have known how to dance, how to write letters, how to give orders around the house for meals and that type of thing. She might learn how to draw a little bit, and she would have some basic housekeeping skills. Like she might know how to plan a menu. She might not necessarily know how to cook anything, but she'd know how to plan a menu or order the food or things like that. And that was considered sufficient for a woman. She didn't need to learn anything else. Another idea that's really common at the time that Mary Wollstonecraft is living is that reading can be dangerous for women. They might get ideas. So women were only supposed to read things like sermons or parts of the Bible, or maybe something that was Greek or Latin, so like the Iliad or the Odyssey or some classical work of literature. But to read novels, like the novels of Jane Austen or any of the 18th century novels that are so delightful and fun to read, you don't want them to read those. What if they get ideas? That would just be horrible. So you've got all these things that really kind of pigeonhole women. They don't have any legal rights. They don't have any rights to their own physical being. They don't have any education. And when you put limitations on any human, you're limiting the options that they have so that their life only becomes half of what it could be. Now, that's not to say that there weren't people who were happy. Of course, there were people who were happy. And of course, there were women who led fulfilled, happy lives because a lot of times people learn how to be happy in the circumstances that they're in, even if those circumstances seem like less than the best. But what Mary Wollstonecraft is talking about in this piece is, why are we putting those limits on each other? Why? Why are we doing that? And what happens to us as a society when we put those limitations on each other? So let's look at it. Let's keep trying to sweep it under the rug and pretend like it doesn't happen. And let's look at what happens when we do that to each other. So you have to think, too, that women during her time did not have the right to vote. That didn't happen until the early 20th century in England and in America. So, again, less than equal political rights. Mary Wollstonecraft's writing of Vindication on the Rights of Woman falls into the same kind of model that we see in American pieces like Common Sense, which probably you've read about in high school, and certainly the Declaration of Independence. These are two pieces that operate on the notion that if we look at something rationally and we see the rationality of it, we can make society better if we look at it rationally. If we subtract emotion from it and just say, this is wrong. What can we do to fix it? And that's really her mindset. It's not men are horrible, men are pigs, I hate men. That's certainly not true. She liked men. It's, what are we doing to each other as humans? And you need to look at the piece that way instead of that she was just over the top feminist man hater. That's just not accurate at all. So she's also kind of harking on something that Abigail Adams, who was the second First Lady of the United States, her husband was John Adams. She wrote to her husband when he was helping to write the founding documents for the United States. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. She meant, you have an opportunity right now. You're laying the groundwork for this new country. Don't forget the women. He did. He probably thought, we've got so many other fish to fry here, Abby. I've just got to move on with this. You're right, but I can't take care of that right now. And putting it off put us where we are now. So, at any rate, Mary Wollstonecraft's thinking about that too as she's writing this piece. She's also attacking this man, JeanJacques Rousseau. You may have heard of JeanJacques Rousseau. He's sometimes called the father of the French Revolution. He'd written some pieces, one in particular, Eloise, and it was kind of, this is the way a woman should be, and it's not the type of woman that Mary Wollstonecraft thinks that women should be. It's more, your job is just to be at home and be pretty. And so she's kind of attacking him too in her piece. So she's certainly thinking about him. So before we start looking at the piece, and by now you should have a copy of that beside you so you can look at it with me, let's think about what the word vindicate means. To vindicate means to clear of accusation, of blame, of suspicion, or doubt, and to do that with supporting arguments or proof. And it also means to insist on recognition and maybe even to avenge. So she's trying to support women. She's trying to support them of not being just dismissed. She's trying to support them in saying, we're human too. We deserve a voice too. And she's trying to do that by showing us pieces of evidence. So this is an incredibly persuasive, rational piece of writing. It's not particularly emotional, although it can rouse some emotion in you as a reader. But as a writer, she is incredibly rational, reasonable. Here's the proof. Here's my argument. Here's the proof. Here's my argument. Here's the proof. It's what you do in a good persuasive paper, and she does it beautifully. It's very difficult to disagree with her because she also plays on our desire to be thought of as rational humans, and in particular, on the part of men to be thought of as rational. She kind of rhetorically boxes them in because if they disagree with her, then they look like, what a pig. Why would anybody want to talk to you and think of you as a rational person if you can't understand this rational, reasonable argument that just happens to be written by a woman? So, um, she says in this piece that women need the same educational rights as men, and they need it for, she lists three reasons that they need it. She says, first of all, women can't be fully human if they don't have an education. How can you expect them to be anything but what they are if you don't give them the same educational opportunities that a man has? They're completely capable of it. There are plenty of women who've done it. Let's go ahead and give them the same opportunities, because you can't expect anything from somebody if you don't give them that basic right to be educated, to learn, to be treated like they're capable of learning. Then she says we should give women the same opportunities of men if we agree that reason and virtue are the same in men and women. They both have an equal capacity to be reasonable, to be virtuous. By that, she may mean moral, sensible, behaving without only thinking about yourself first. Just behaving in a way that would be appropriate for the smooth functioning of society as a whole. And again, she's counting on you not wanting to admit that you don't agree, because that would make you look really, really bad. It's like if you see a commercial about give your money to saving these pets, you don't want to say out loud, well, I don't want to give money to that, because you don't want people to think that you want someone to be bad to pets. That makes you look horrible. Even if you don't, that's not particularly an interest of yours, you wouldn't want to admit, because it would make you look really bad. And she's counting on that. That's how she's rhetorically boxing you in as a reader. She also says that if we can educate men and women in similar ways and treat them both like they're rational and moral and capable of doing good things that will further the good of society, then we're all going to benefit. It's going to make it better for every single one of us, not just for one, but for everything. And we need to start looking at that. We can't get any further as a society until we start taking care of each other in ways that are equal, that give us both the same types of opportunity. She says in this piece that strength and usefulness are sacrificed to beauty, and the flaunting leaves, after having pleased a fastidious eye, fade, disregarded on the stalk long before the season when they ought to have arrived at maturity. What she's saying is we're focused on women being pretty. Women are pretty. They're lovely. Who doesn't like to see a beautiful human? We all do. No matter what form that human comes in, if it's beautiful to us, that's one of the best parts of life, is seeing somebody that you find attractive. But she's saying, why are we valuing that beauty above and beyond everything else? And we value it so much when somebody is really young, when they have flaunting leaves, like when a flower first opens up. And I don't know where you grew up in. I grew up in Texas, and I grew up hearing she's really blossomed, or she's really blossomed out, meaning that this girl has suddenly become very appealing and pretty and womanly and feminine. And that's a marvelous thing. But why are we putting so much value on that physical appearance? when at the same time that that physical appearance is at its peak, so is that person's ability to learn and grow and develop and to become something more than just a pretty girl, because that's going to go away. That'll fade over time. But the intellect and morality and rationality, those are things that can only grow over time, not fade. So she's trying to put our focus on that. And it's smart that she's acknowledging that we like pretty women. She knows that we do. If she doesn't acknowledge that, then it makes it look like she doesn't understand her audience very well. It's called a counter argument. Hey, here's the big thing you're going to say, I don't agree with you on. Here it is. I'm going to stick it in your face. I'm going to acknowledge it, and I'm going to tell you how to get around it. So this just shows us what an incredible amount of skill she has as a persuasive writer. She knows what people are going to disagree with, and let's just look at it right here and get it out here in the open so we can move on with the rest of my argument. And she does that frequently in this piece. Now, you all are only reading the introduction, but I can assure you throughout the rest of it, she continues to do the same thing. That's a lot of skill as a writer. She's very skilled. She also says a little further in, my own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures, instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. She's kind of cutting through the BS. I'm not going to treat you like, oh, boo-boo, let me fix this for you. She's not going to do that to you. That may have been really shocking to some people. You can't treat a woman like that. Well, of course you can treat any human like that. And what person doesn't like to be treated with respect? Every person likes to be treated with respect, with kindness, with the idea that they are worthy of attention and that what they have to say is worthy of hearing. And that's what she's going to do. She's just cutting through it. I'm not going to treat you like you're dumb, because you're not. She also acknowledges some women govern their husbands without degrading themselves, because intellect will always govern. I think in this she's saying women may have a real limited amount of power in terms of the law, but trust me, there are women who rule the roost in their homes. You all probably know it. It may be that way in your house. There are things that your mom says this is how it's going to be, and that's how it is. And dad doesn't argue. It goes the opposite way too. But it's another counter argument. She's acknowledging there are women who operate within the bounds of power that they have available to them. And they can do it quite well. Some of them better than others. So she's not saying all women are weak and incapable and treated badly. She's acknowledging there's some powerful women out there. Abigail Adams, we looked at that as we started. She talked to her husband up front, dear friend. Their letter started, dear friend, on a more equal plane. And Mary Wollstonecraft is trying to get us to that same equal plane with her language. Okay? All right. So that's as much as I'm going to talk to you about with Mary Wollstonecraft. If you have questions, let's go ahead and get them posted on the discussion topics. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Thanks a lot.